How's everybody doing today? Welcome back to week 4. Man, we are in the middle of this semester. So I hope everybody's going well. Your chemistry class, Tara, with your long names. I love the names that they make for those elements. It's always freaking hilarious, right? Everybody doing well today? Darm Stadium. Hey, that's actually a cool name, I think. I don't know. I enjoy being with you too, Kimia, I guess it is. So is everybody doing well today? Congratulations to those who played the Neuromatrix and scored 10,000 this week. Very impressive. Very impressive. All right, it's 11 o'clock. It's probably about time to get started. Everybody ready for lecture? Yeah, it was a big flex, Michael. Absolutely. I was impressed with you, by the way, Mike. You did a great job. Let's do this. I like that attitude, Keelan. Oh, look at that. Maya's tired. I'm sorry. Camilla? All right, cool. All right, well, this week's going to be all about, it seems like the Neuromatrix always seems to be about the Thursday lecture. So it's going to be on Piaget and Erik Erikson this week. So be sure to come to the Thursday lecture, okay? All right, Camilla, it's a deal then. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about Chapter 4, Developmental Psychology. Developmental psychology is probably the most useful psychology class you can take. Okay, so you're taking intro psych right now. It's sort of a general overview of the whole field. After you take this class, you can then begin taking individual areas of psychology. So they have a biological psychology class, they have a social psychology class, they have a cognitive developmental psychology class, and they have a developmental psychology class. And in my opinion, for my money, developmental psychology is the best psychology class you can take because it encompasses all of the other classes, but puts them in the context of how people's ability changes. So cognitive psychology is going to teach you how people think. But developmental psychology class is going to teach you how the ability to think develops. Biological psychology is going to teach you all about the neurotransmitters and the brain structures. But developmental psychology is going to teach you about how these neurotransmitters and brain areas develop over the lifespan. And there's cognitive development, there's social development. And so developmental psychology is probably the most important psychology class that you can take. So we're going to talk a little bit today about why the developmental perspective is important. We're going to talk about prenatal development and milestone evaluation to make sure your baby is healthy. And we're going to talk a little bit about attachment in early childhood, the bond between the primary caregiver and the child. And we're going to talk just briefly about cognitive development in late adulthood. It's going to kind of be a mishmash of topics this week in class. Everybody ready to go? I'm assuming yes, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Okay, lifespan development. The whole point of the developmental psychology perspective is that it improves the length, it increases the length and the quality of people's life. I don't know if you knew this, but in 1900, the average lifespan was 47 years old. That meant that of all the people born in your year, half of them were dead by the age of 47. I'm 51. Can you imagine? I can't even imagine thinking that I have a 50% chance of already being dead. Dead. So the thing is, in 1900, that's why they were getting married so early. Absolutely, Etta. And lots of kids died in infancy and childbirth, 4 or 5 years of age. So what the developmental perspective has done for us over the past 100 years is it's allowed us to figure out how best to grow healthy human beings. And I would tell you now that the average lifespan is 79 years. We've increased the average lifespan of people over 30 years. And I would say that most of that increase has come because of improvements in developmental psychology. And so learning about what humans needs allows us to create the conditions for healthy growth. And in fact, if you look at this chart right up here in the top right, this is a demonstration of what we might call the rectangularization of the survival curve. If you look at the blue line, that represents the average life trajectory in 1900. See how a lot of people died right there between 0 and 5 years old. See how steeply that line drops? And then you see a lot of people died, and then it evens out, and people didn't die as much until you get into your 70s, 80s, and 90s. But now what you'll see is that we have a much smaller number of people dying in infancy and early childhood. And this, along with other knowledge that we've developed about safety, has allowed us to really improve the length and quality of people's lifespans. Okay, so lifespan development. We typically think of it as the multidisciplinary study of how people change over the course of the lifespan, from conception to death. Most people, when they think of child development, they think of child development, and they think of 2 to 12 years of age as being when we change. No, the developmental perspective understands that life begins at conception, and we need to start thinking about issues of safety and health right there, and that you are not done until the day you die. So your mind is changing. Even now, some of you may be, I'm 30 years old, I'm 25 years old, I'm done. No, you're not done. You will not be done until the day you die developing. Okay, so the lifespan development is interested in how people change over the course of lifespan, from conception all the way to death. Now, we study how human beings change in 3 broad areas, okay? So human beings' brain and nervous system change. We'll call that physical or biological development. Right? And so we're going to talk a little bit about how your brain, your neurons, and all of this change and develop over the course of the lifespan. We're going to learn what kinds of developmental psychologists know what kinds of vitamins and what kind of food to feed children so that their bodies grow healthy during the lifespan. So one way we look at development is physical development. Who's the tallest in your class? Who's the shortest in your class? The other way in which human beings change is mentally, through cognitive development. All right. Now, you may be the tallest kid in your class, but your mind may be slower in development. So these things don't develop at the same trajectories, and that's why we separate them out, because your biological development may be faster or slower than your cognitive development. Your biological development may be slower or faster than your socio-emotional development. So we know that human beings change over 3 different areas of human development, okay? Physical development, cognitive development, and socio-emotional or personality development. And if you will, think about your 3rd grade class. Some of your students were the tallest, biggest kids in class. Their physical development was ahead of all the others. But some of your kids had better math skills and had developed intellectual thinking and focus skills, so they were ahead cognitively. And then some of you might have been the most mature person in your class, while some of your kids were spoiled and immature. And so these represent the 3 domains of development which cognitive psychologists study. And when you take my developmental psychology class, and I know some of you will, what you're going to find is that the actual developmental psychology book is broken up by areas of development. So chapter 4 is physical development in infancy. Chapter 5 is cognitive development in infancy. Chapter 6 in the developmental psych is going to be socio-emotional development in infancy, right? And so these 3 domains are how we subdivide the development of human being and the research of human beings. Now, What I want to talk to you a little bit about today is prenatal development and about having a healthy baby. And that's going to focus mainly on the prenatal development and the early childhood experience. And we're going to talk about that because that's featured heavily in this particular, in your particular textbook, okay? So, prenatal development. So we're going to talk about what happens before you're even born. So there are 3 stages of prenatal development that we typically think about. When a sperm and an egg fuse and make a zygote, a fertilized egg cell, that egg cell is going to change over the course of 9 months, and it's going to go through these very important changes. Now, what you need to know as a mother is what's happening as that baby's developing and how your behaviors can affect the quality of that baby's development. So briefly, I'd like to tell you about the prenatal development. It's divided into 3 periods: a germinal period, an embryonic period, and a fetal period. And different things happen in each of these periods of prenatal development. So for the first 2 weeks of the zygote's development, it's in the germinal period. It's fertilized, it's floating down the fallopian tube and implanting into the uterine wall. That takes about 0 to 2 weeks. Now, this zygote, now called a blastocyst, is going to begin developing a little bitty crease on the very backside outside of the blastocyst. And when this crease starts to develop, that's going to form into the spinal column. And when this neural crease begins to develop and the nervous system begins to develop, we say that the baby is now in the embryonic period of development. Now, this is important because during this 3 to 8 week period right here, the most important part of the development of the prenatal development occurs, and that's what we call organogenesis. And this is when all of the major systems in your body begin developing. It starts with the development of the nervous system, you'll see right here, but then your heart's going to develop, your organs are going to develop, your arm buds are going to develop, your leg buds are going to develop. So all of these important parts of your body are going to begin growing during the embryonic period. We call this organogenesis. So at week 1.5, you're going to be a ball of cells and you're not going to look like a baby. By 8 weeks, you're going to look like a weird looking tadpole alien human because all of the shapes and parts of the body have begun to develop. And that's what we call the embryonic period. Now, if you look at this chart that I have down here, you can see sort of this is a demonstration of the trajectory of all of these systems that have to develop as we're born. So you'll see that the central nervous system begins developing at week 2. The heart begins developing sort of in the middle of week 3. The arms, legs, begin developing in the middle of week 4, and you'll see how each of these systems begins developing during the embryonic period. Now you'll notice that the bars, they have long bars, and the bars represent how long that system takes to go from beginning to end. So you'll see the central nervous system starts at 2 weeks, and it's actually not done by the time the baby's born. In fact, I will tell you, your nervous system is not done developing until the age of 25. So the green part of the line represents when that developing system is most susceptible to damage from these outside environmental substances we'll call teratogens. Okay, now, so you can see that the embryonic period is the most sensitive part of the pregnancy because all of these structures are beginning to develop. If the mom ingests some sort of teratogenic substance during these weeks, it will lead to sometimes it can lead to the misdevelopment of that structure. It won't even grow properly. Your heart may be deformed. Your spinal column may be deformed. Your arms may not form properly. Now, if the mom is exposed to a teratogen after that organogenesis period, typically the damage will be less severe and it'll be more function rather than structure that is damaged. But what I want you to appreciate from this chart is that the most sensitive time for the mom is from weeks 3 to 8 during the embryonic period when organogenesis is occurring. Now, the fetal period takes the longest, and this is from like week 8 to week 40. And this is when all of the systems begin maturing and the baby puts on a ton of weight during this stage. Miscarriage is less likely during the fetal period. It's more likely during the embryonic period when chromosome and genetic disorders lead to the malfunctioning of the developing embryo. Okay? Now, as I said earlier, teratogens are any environmental substance that can harm prenatal development. There is a list of these substances on page 135. You should take a look at them and be able to tell me that they are teratogenic. So, and most of them you'll know: alcohol, cigarettes, opioids, heroin. Turns out acne medication can even be teratogenic. You have to be careful with the drugs you take when you're pregnant. All right, so your book talks about what determines the impact of teratogens. Well, it's the amount of the teratogen you ingest, but as I just mentioned, it also depends upon the timing of the teratogen exposure, and also to a certain extent, it depends upon your genetic susceptibility to that particular teratogen. Now, if your baby's born before 37 weeks, your baby is what we call premature. And so infant mortality rate increases. Your child's more likely to have a physical developmental disability, and school-related disorders. Intellectual development and school-related disorders are much more likely in children who are born premature or low birth weight. Low birth weight is one of the things that can really be dangerous for your baby. In fact, I've got a video about mothers who are hooked on opioids and heroin. And it turns out that if a mom's hooked on heroin, they actually don't suggest that she kick cold turkey during that, because that can lead to premature and low birth weight babies, the stress of quitting the drug, and it can actually lead to a low birth weight baby, which is dangerous. Instead, what they usually do is put these babies on methadone. Okay, I sure will, Etta. They put these babies on methadone, and then they wean them off the drug after they're born, because it turns out that a drug dependency is a little bit easier to treat than low birth weight. Exactly. A lot of mothers play music and read while the baby is in the womb. You know, there is research to suggest there are some people who think that listening to classical music especially increases your child's mathematical ability. The link for that is kind of tenuous. It turns out that musical stimulation of classical music especially kind of fires up part of your parietal lobe that leads to increases in math ability for a short time. It sort of, if you will, warms your brain up. But it turns out that babies are born knowing their mother's voices. I'm not sure if it necessarily helps in the development, Nicole, or Camilla, you're asking that question, but I do know that babies are born able to recognize their mother's voices. Now, once the baby's born, touch and talking are very important for stimulating that brain. But I'm not sure the research necessarily talks about the effect of talking to your children prenatally, Camilla. But definitely it's important after your child's born. A very good question, thank you. It is kind of sad, Nicole, about the mothers. And you know, the crappy thing, at least in this video, is what you're going to find is that a lot of these mothers get caught up accidentally. They're not trying to be heroin or drug abusers. Some of them may have an injury or surgery. The doctor prescribes opioids, and suddenly they find themselves hooked. And so it's really sad, because a lot of these moms aren't even trying to engage in these kinds of dangerous behaviors. Yes, they do children do recognize their mom's voice right after birth, and so that suggests that the baby definitely can hear and familiarizes themselves with the mom during pregnancy. Yes, that is a good point, Etta. Now, so you're born. Your nervous system is going to change in two ways. Yes, they do. Good point, Michael. Your brain is going to change in two ways. And I want you to think of this change in your brain as occurring because of learning and maturation. Now, learning is a change that occurs over time due to environmental experience. Okay? And we're going to differentiate that from maturation, which is change that occurs as a result of genetic programming. Do you folks understand the difference between learning and maturity? So part of who you are as an adult is based on the experiences that you have in your life. Your parents teach you how to speak a language. Your parents teach you math. Your parents teach you colors, shapes. You learn all of these things. But you also change based on genetic instructions. You know what? That's a great question that I'm going to answer in just a second, Jesse, about babies in orphanages. It turns out that actually, let me get to my lecture and then I'll mention that. So let me start off by talking about maturation. There is a programmed genetic change that occurs in your brain. The reason that babies are born, yes, I do. The reason that babies are born so helpless is because myelin tissue is missing from their brain. So when your brain is born, you have all the brain circuits you will ever need. You have your language circuit, you have your visual circuit, you have your motor cortex, you have your temporal lobe, you have all the circuits, but the connections among them aren't complete. What has to happen is this myelin, this fatty tissue, is going to grow around the axons of the larger neurons. And as that happens, it's going to connect these different parts of your brain, and it's going to make these different parts of your brain begin acting more efficiently and effectively. Right? Now, the reason we're born this way is because we have to get this big head through the birth canal. Your big competitive advantage in the animal world is your big stinking brain. It's not your legs or your arms. You can't run fast. They can do some things. You can't run fast. You're not very strong. You can't fly. You can't see good at night. In fact, a good-sized squirrel would kick your ass, right? But the reason that we rule the world is because of our brain, this big brain. But you have to get it through the birth canal. So what happens is it comes incomplete, and it myelinates over the course of the first 25 years of your life, actually. Most of the myelination is going to occur early in childhood, but your brain's not done myelinating till 25. And this programmed myelination around axons begins to mature different parts of your brain. And if you'll see this picture right here, you'll see that some parts of your brain myelinate earlier than others. So your vision and your motor cortex, so your ability to see and move, myelinates relatively early. But if you've ever played a memory game with a child, you know their memory stinks. Their impulse control in their frontal lobe stinks because it's not myelinated. And kids aren't really able to think critically because their critical thinking area isn't myelinated. So what you're going to see is as the brain begins to myelinate, these different abilities will come online. Now, Etta talks about children being born with some sort of innate abilities, and this is true. Infants come with what we call primitive reflex behaviors. And these primitive reflex behaviors help give us some adaptive behaviors until our brain begins to take voluntary control of our behavior. So these primitive reflexes start and then they begin to disappear during the first year as different parts of your brain begin to myelinate. But as Etta mentions, we are born with some sort of pre-programmed behaviors. Now, I forget who it was that asked about the stimulation and the orphanages question. One of the other things that we know about a human brain is that in order for a person to develop normally, they have to be stimulated. How stimulated, Chris, you ask? Do you need to read them French? No. Do you need to teach them classic Greek literature? Absolutely not. Do you need to try and teach your 9-month-old how to do calculus? No. You know what you need to do? You need to play with your baby. That's all you do. You play with your baby, you talk to your baby, you tickle your baby. You basically just goose that little sucker for the first year. And as you're stimulating a baby, yes, you do. You talk to them a lot. But as you talk to them and show them things and play with them, what's happening is their brain's synapses are beginning to knit together. They're beginning to knit together. So if you remember from chapter 2, when we talked about biological psychology, I suggested to you that one nerve's terminal buttons connect with another nerve's dendrites, right? And they make connections. Well, the thing about neurons is as one neuron stimulates the other neuron releases, if you will, food that feeds it. And it causes that one neuron to start growing, because if you water a plant, it will start to grow. And what happens is as one neural connection stimulates another, they begin to grow together. And you get this synaptic blooming in this part of your brain. Now, your brain creates twice as many synaptic connections as you need. So you get this exuberant synaptic growth as you talk to your baby. It's just brain is going to knit together all these little synapses and dendrites. But then your baby's brain is going to figure out which of these neural connections it needs and which of the ones it doesn't need. So the ones that it doesn't use very often, this neuron's not going to fertilize this neuron. And you know what happens to a plant when you don't fertilize it? It withers and dies. So there's actually, that's a good question, Riley, and I'll answer that in a minute. So actually what happens in your brain is you have this dendritic growth, this blooming that occurs and just blows up. And then some of these connections start to die. And what's left are the mature neural connections that your brain is going to need. So if you look at the picture I have down here, you see we've got the same neurons in each of these 3 panels. The first panel is you at birth. Then you at 6 years of age, all these neurons have really knitted each other together. And then if you look at this brain at 14, still the same number of neurons, but the connections have died off some. And so you actually have fewer neural connections, but these are the mature ones that you are going to need. People with savant syndrome typically have some sort of brain damage that rewires their brain in a unique way that gives them a very limited super duper talent, but usually leaves them with a state of disability in a lot of ways, Shahir. Now, Riley wants to ask this question, how come some kids have better talents than others? You know what? There are genetic differences in brains, okay? So if you talk Tom Brady, the football player, I'll bet you his kid probably can throw a football, right? My kids are going to be genetically smart because I'm a pretty genetically clever kind of guy. So there is a certain genetic endowment that we are all born with, and it turns out that experience, while helpful, is not as important as the genetic endowment you're built with. But Riley, I would say we have what we would call you're right, my big brain. I'm 5'6", Chris. I have to flex about something. That's all I've got, right? Or be good looking like mommy. Absolutely. See, I can't flex there either. All I've got's the IQ, Chris. So the weird thing is, there is what we would call a reaction range about your genetic predisposition, right? So you're born with a certain genetic predisposition. If you are in the most stimulating environment possible, your range, you may go up a little bit, but you're not going to go from an IQ of 100 to genius level, right? But let's say your IQ is 100 and you grow up in an orphanage and you're not stimulated, your IQ might not reach your genetic set point of 100. It might only make it to 85 or 90. So around each genetic endowment that we have, there's a reaction range at which the environment can affect our abilities. 6'3". See, that's not even fair, Michael. I hope you're not smart too, right? Smart, good looking, and tall. I hate those kind of guys. They have everything. Ha ha ha. Okay, so neuroplasticity. And the weird thing about the brain is the brain may adapt to environmental forces or neural damage to reprogram the brain if necessary. Some people are actually born with parts of their brain missing, and yet these people still grow up to be normal. IQ relative, it's measured in a relative sense. Keelan, IQ is measured in a relative sense. I can't tell you absolutely because I don't know what absolute knowledge is. IQ tests use the deviation method. People who score 100, their raw score just puts them in the 50th percentile. And the higher you score relative to that person, the higher your IQ is. And you know what, Etta, that's a great lecture that Keelan, we're going to do on chapter 8. I'm going to be giving an IQ lecture and talking about that. He is not super smart or attending college moment, but he is 12 or something. Yes, there are some people that are just born with hyper-functioning minds. And yeah, you will see the Doogie Housers of the world that are 12 years old in medical school. And you know what? Here's the thing. One of the big mistakes that I see in my upper middle class affluent parents is that they think that you need to or can do that with your kid. Some kids can read at 3. That doesn't mean that every kid should or that your kid is a failure if they can't, right? And so there are some of those super smart kids, but your kid's not going to be a genius unless you genetically have that there for them. But what you do is you provide a stimulating environment, and it allows that brain to grow to its maximum potential, whatever that is. Man, you are asking a bunch of great questions today. Does it sound like the dumbest question in the world? Does the place where we were born? I'm not sure exactly what you mean by place, like city, town. I don't think there are really necessarily cultural differences or differences based on place in IQ, my friend. Right. Some people are born smart AF, but you know what? I don't think that's necessarily located to a particular place. It just happens to be if you win the genetic draw, the genetic lottery with your parents. Now, next week, I'm going to have you watch the story of a guy named Ben Underwood. And Ben Underwood had his eyes removed when he was 3 because he had cancer of the optic nerves. He had his eyes removed, and his brain rewired himself so that he could use his ears to echolocate. So this guy can see with his ears. I'm glad you watched it, Etta. I'm going to show that to everybody else next week. And this is a great demonstration of neuroplasticity. Your brain actually can rewire itself to account for sort of damage that you experience early in your life. Some people are born at a hospital. You know, about 98% of Americans, 98.5% of Americans are born in hospitals these days. Different culturally around the world. And one of the things I know about this class is we have an incredibly multinational crowd. All I can do is speak to what I know about American babies. Most of us are born in the hospital. But when I go to Vietnam, I'm taller than the group of ladies I took pictures with. Wow. That's a good point, Jessica. You know, I've heard that there's that people in North Korea are growing way, way smaller, and this probably has to do with the famine conditions that have existed in this country. So I guess there are cultural differences in size, and so I don't have any research to support it, Riley, but maybe there are cultural differences in intellect. Maybe those Germans are super smart people. Or maybe those Polish people are super duper smart. That's what I've heard. I've heard that those Polish people are super, super smart, right, Etta? Okay, now, here's the deal. I cannot see your brain developing. Doctors cannot see your brain developing. But this brain development is going to allow you to engage in everything else you do. Your ability to move your body, your ability to think, and your personality. all depend upon your physiological development, this stuff that's going on in the brain. I've never heard the wheel story. That's kind of interesting, Michael. That's very interesting. But here's the deal. We can't see what's going on in your nervous system. So what I need to do is I want to find a way to figure out what's going on in your brain, because if you have a problem, if there's a developmental delay or a developmental problem, one of the things we know about neuroplasticity is the earlier I address that problem, the better the outcomes are for the child. So if you have autistic, if you're on the spectrum, it is much better to get treatment as a 1-year-old than to get treatment as an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old. So editors riffing on the genius Polish meme here. We're smart, but we also think outside the box too. I hear you. You know what? I like to think that Americans are so smart that they can be lazy, because some of my American students can be lazier than my international students, but yet we invent cool things. So I'd like to think of Americans as genius slackers. I don't know. But who knows? So I can't see your brain developing, but I want to know if you have a developmental delay so that I can address that problem and help you out. So what we've discovered, this fellow named Arnold Giselle discovered this, man, back in the 1930s, almost 100 years ago, right, Riley? We're genius slackers. Americans know how, we're lazy, so we're going to figure out how to do it easier. So, milestones. What he found was that you could identify these milestone behaviors, which are what we call typical behaviors that all children can do at a certain age. And his insight was, if you can figure out when these behaviors are supposed to occur, you can evaluate individual people to find out if they're behind or ahead. Does that make sense? And so a milestone is an ability that children with normal neurological development should be able to do. Now, we start with infant reflexes that disappear. So a healthy child actually has reflexes at birth, not just the adult reflexes, but they have a special set of infant reflexes. And then as they grow over the first 2 to 5 to 10 years, they develop these abilities at predictable times. So if you look right here, I have a chart for what we call the gross motor behaviors of a child. Gross motor are any big movement that you make that uses a big muscle. Standing up is a gross motor function. Lifting your arms is gross motor function. Kicking somebody in the butt is a gross motor function. Fine motor functions are any muscle movements that require teeny tiny muscles, like writing, right? And you'll notice the kindergarten kids, they write with the big fat pencil, and that's because their fine motor abilities haven't developed as well. Okay, so exactly, that dexterity, and that's why I'm a baseball player all my life. Roddenberry's have to play baseball. I don't care anything about my kids being smart, dumb, tall, short, but they better play baseball because Roddenberry's play baseball. And one of the things that I found from a long history in coaching baseball is that 4-year-olds aren't very good at baseball. They don't have the dexterity. Well, you're 6'3", Michael. I'm a baseball player, man. I tried to stay off the football field because they wanted to use me for the football. So these are some milestone behaviors. So what you're going to see is that children have this predictable unfolding of their behaviors. Physical behaviors, they have cognitive behaviors that unfold, social behaviors, and even language behaviors. So your child is supposed to start babbling around 3 or 4 months. Your child's supposed to say their first word sometimes, or 6 months. Your child's supposed to say their first word maybe around a year. Your baby's supposed to be able to walk sometime around 12 months. And so what we do is we use these milestones to sort of gauge if our child is developing healthily or non-healthily. And if we find that the child has a developmental delay, then we get on it and try to provide extra help to that child to overcome that developmental problem. Now, when you go to your doctor may give you a formal form to fill out where you check off what your kid can and can't do. And they have one that I took my kids to Fuquay Pediatrics, and they had one called the Ages and Stages questionnaire. I don't know if any of you are familiar. There you go, Jessica. right on time, learning to stand at 8 months. And so they may do it formally, or a lot of times doctors do it informally. They'll chat you up about your kid. So Jessica, your doctor's probably asking you to talk about your kid. And you as a proud parent are saying, well, he can stand on his own. He can do this. He can do this. He can do this. Your doctor's not necessarily proud of your kids. Your doctor's just listening for milestones, and they want to hear certain things. And if your child's not doing certain things, then the doctor's going to say, well, tell me about this. They're then going to get real interested. So do you see how you understand, you see how milestones can be used to gauge the health of development? Boy, we're running so much out of time. I'm going to try to finish up. Maybe I'll just get through language development today. So language, it turns out that human beings have this innate competence for learning a language. We are everybody is able to learn how to speak a language, no matter how knuckleheaded you are. Language and intelligence are completely independent in that you can be super smart, but if you've got damage to your language area of your brain, you won't be able to talk. On the other hand, you may be functionally retarded or have a diagnosis of low intellectual functioning, and yet you can still talk. Language, human beings have this innate ability to learn language. And this ability has been referred to as a language acquisition device. Now, you don't actually have that in your brain. Instead of a device, think of it as a capacity. Now, the weird thing is, this capacity goes away if you don't use it. Like I suggested to you, the brain has neural flexibility. Your brain is plastic. So if you don't use an ability, that brain area that controls that ability will go control something else. And so human beings have critical periods when brains need to be stimulated in order for abilities to develop normally. I don't know if you knew this, but you have a critical period for vision. It turns out if you don't see lines, horizontal or perpendicular lines, early in your life, your brain will not develop the ability to see horizontal or perpendicular lines. It turns out that with language, if you don't, for attachment, there is a critical period during the first year of your life when you have to bond with your mom. And if you don't, you will have trouble bonding the rest of your life. Same thing with language. If you aren't exposed to language in the first couple of years of your life, you will not ever develop the ability to develop mature language abilities. And yes, people can speak dozens of languages, and it's easier to learn them the younger you are. Michael Kirchhoff learned in high school. Good for you. Your dad speaks 17 languages fluently. You know what, Riley? I hate your dad. I am so jealous of your dad, doggone it. He's a polyglot. People who can speak multiple languages always make me feel incredibly inferior because I have trouble just speaking this one English language. Now, I am impressed, though, Riley. 17 language. You know what? I find most of my students from Africa speak at least 3 languages. English, some sort of colonial language, and then their local dialect language. And if anybody's here who wants to speak to that, I would love for you to speak up and tell us what languages you speak. Difference between receptive language and productive language. Etta, I'll bet you can tell that your 8-month knows when you're talking to them and knows what you're saying, but yet they can't speak yet. Right? Receptive language is the ability to understand language, and this usually comes along a little bit earlier than productive language. So your kid's going to learn to understand you before they learn to communicate themselves. It develops more slowly, right? And one of the last things that your kid's going to learn is pragmatics. So first they learn their sounds, their phonemes, ba ba ba, ga ga ga, da da da, their phonemes, and then they're going to learn their morphemes. Milk is a word. ED is a unit of meaning I used to do it, right? And so you're going to learn your sounds, and then you're going to learn your units of meaning, and then you're going to learn how to put them together into short sentences called telegraph sentences. And then the last thing that you learn is how, I'm sorry. Somebody else in the chat bar talked about their Oh, no, excuse me. It was Jessica talking about her 8-month-old baby. Oops. I'm sorry. I missed that in the chat bar. Okay, and pragmatics is the last part of language to develop, and that's knowing how to take turns, knowing what to talk about, knowing what not to talk about, right? Is a very important part. So conversational ability. So your child learns their sounds first, then they learn which are phonemes, then they learn their meanings, which is morphemes, milk, S is plural. It means a lot of things, right? And then they learn their telegraphic speech, how to put these morphemes together to create a unit of a sentence meaning. And then they learn pragmatics, which is the ability to converse. Okay, and so if you'll see right here, we've got language milestones that you should see in your children. They should start cooing around 2 to 6 months. Your kids should start practicing their phonemes around 6 months. Ba ba ba, ga ga ga, da da da. Your kids' first word's usually going to be around 12 months of age. Now, culture does affect the development of milestones. I've seen some parents that do everything for their kid. They totally spoil their infant. What kid's going to learn to speak if I don't have to, right? And so if you the environment can affect the development of milestones. It turns out that babies don't lift their heads as early as they used to. You know why? Because in the 1950s and 60s, parents were encouraged to put their kids to sleep on their stomach because this was thought to build up neck control and strengthen the core. Now, do we put babies on their back or their front? We put them on somebody type in. We put them on their back, absolutely, because we're afraid of SIDS. And you know what this means? This means kids don't get as much workout with their necks. And so what you're going to see is that at least in American babies, I don't know about all cultures, what you're going to see is that kids don't lift their heads quite as early as they used to. Right? And so if you do all your kids talking, spoil your kid, do everything that your little infant needs and speak for them, they will take longer to reach that milestone. But so these are sort of the milestone expectations that we have for babies. What about a pacifier? What do you mean about the pacifier, Ed? I'm not sure. What do you mean? Oh, no pillows, toys in the crib to avoid suffocation. Absolutely. Yeah. All right, Riley, you obviously understood Edda's question and you answered it, so that's good because I'm a little bit lost. I've been here focusing on the lecture. You know what? We are 45 minutes in, and I feel like I need to let you go, although I have not finished. I have not finished this chapter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add attachment to Thursday's chapter, and we'll talk a little bit about attachment, and then I'm going to talk, which is socio-emotional development, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about cognitive development and Jean Piaget's theory of cognitive development. Oh, when kids die? So you're saying that... I'm not sure what the link is between SIDS and pacifiers. But I will find that information out. Okay, you know what? I've come down to the end of a lecture. I didn't talk as fast as I wanted to. My apologies. We'll finish up attachment and cognitive development tomorrow. You folks were absolutely amazing participating in the lecture today. I just saw the chat bar. It was blowing up. Thank you for staying engaged and asking all these really great questions. You made this class more interesting for me, and I hope you got more out of this class. Congratulations to everybody who did well on the Neuromatrix this week. I sent around a Neuromatrix update video, and the Neuromatrix information has been updated in the folder. That's all I have to say today. I hope to see everybody in the webinars this week. We're going to be talking about prenatal development. I've got an amazing TED Talk by a lady who talks about how early childhood stress can affect the very physiological development of your body. And so we're going to be talking about ACEs. And I want you to find out what your ACEs score. What happened to you? Did you have adverse childhood experiences in your life? And how has that affected your physical development? If you don't have any questions, I'm going to say goodbye, but I will see you tonight, hopefully in the Tuesday night lecture, if not tonight, Wednesday or Thursday. Till then, take care, folks.